Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that sounds completely insane until you realize it's completely true. Lithium, the mood-stabilizing psychiatric drug that keeps millions of people from spiraling into the abyss, was casually hanging out in your great-grandmother's soda for decades, like it was no big deal. We're talking about a substance that literally alters your brain chemistry, marketed as a refreshing beverage alongside Coca-Cola. This is the story of how a simple element discovered in some Swedish rocks became medicine, became a soft drink, got banned, came back as the gold standard for treating bipolar disorder, and somehow ended up being one of the strangest, most misunderstood substances in modern psychiatry. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. A huge thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. Your curiosity shapes this channel more than you know, and I'm genuinely grateful. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and somehow you're all awake. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Also, the channel is now live on Spotify, so if you prefer listening there, the link's in the description. Now, pause for a second and think about this. Have you ever wondered how a psychiatric medication ended up in soda? What kind of regulatory Wild West allowed that to happen? How did doctors even figure out lithium worked for mental illness in the first place? Did someone just randomly start handing out rocks to sad people? And if it was in soda for 100 years, does that mean our ancestors were accidentally medicating themselves every time they cracked open a cold one? Could you have walked into a pharmacy in 1947, ordered a lithium citrate fizzy drink, and called it self-care? And here's the real question. If lithium is so effective, why did it take psychiatry so long to embrace it? And why does it still carry such a complicated reputation today? Congratulations! You've just woken up in 1817. You're a Swedish chemist named Johan August Arfwedson, and you've just discovered a new element hiding in a mineral called petalite. You have no idea that this light silvery metal will one day stabilize the minds of millions, get banned, make a comeback, and spark debates that will rage for 2 centuries. But right now, you're just trying to figure out what to name it. Welcome to the strange, unexpected, and deeply human history of lithium. Let's start at the beginning, because every good pharmaceutical disaster begins with someone poking at rocks they probably shouldn't be poking at. In 1817, Johan August Arfwedson was working in the lab of the famous Swedish chemist Jöns Jacob Berzelius, analyzing minerals like a man who had nothing better to do on a Tuesday afternoon. He was studying petalite, a mineral from a Swedish island, when he noticed something odd. There was an unknown alkali metal hiding inside. He'd found lithium, from the Greek word lithos, meaning stone. Arfwedson didn't know it yet, but he'd just discovered one of the lightest elements on Earth, one that floats on water, reacts violently with moisture, and would eventually become both a miracle drug and a carbonated beverage. At the time, lithium was just a curiosity, a lab novelty with no obvious use. No one was thinking about mental health or soda fountains. They were just excited that science had expanded the periodic table by one more element, which in 1817 was basically the equivalent of going viral. Picture this. You're Arfwedson, hunched over your workbench in Stockholm, surrounded by minerals that all look basically the same: grey, boring, slightly dusty. You've been heating them, dissolving them in acids, watching them bubble and fizz like a particularly disappointing chemistry demonstration. And then suddenly, this one mineral does something different. The flame test burns crimson red. The residue won't dissolve properly. There's something in there that doesn't match anything you've seen before. It's like finding a typo in a book you've read 100 times, small but impossible to ignore once you've noticed it. Berzelius, your boss and one of the most respected chemists in Europe, gets interested. Together, you isolate this new element. It's soft, silvery white, and so reactive that it has to be stored in mineral oil or it'll corrode in front of your eyes. Drop it in water and it dances across the surface, hissing and popping, releasing hydrogen gas. It's both fascinating and slightly terrifying, like most things discovered in 19th century chemistry labs. You name it, lithium. Not after a person, not after a place, but after stone itself. Lithos. Because you found it locked inside rock, and because 19th century chemists were practical about these things. No flowery mythology, no grand gestures. Just, we found it in a stone, so we're calling it stone element. Done. The scientific community receives your discovery with polite enthusiasm. Another element for the growing periodic table. Another piece of the puzzle. But practical applications? None immediately obvious. Lithium is too reactive to use structurally. It's too rare to be industrially useful. It's just there. A scientific curiosity. A footnote in chemistry textbooks. Arfwedson himself moves on to other projects. He never makes much money from the discovery. There are no patents on elements, no royalties, no naming rights that pay dividends. He lives a quiet life as a chemist and dies in 1841, long before anyone figures out that his lightweight reactive metal could calm the human mind. And here's the beautiful irony. The element named for stone, solid, unchanging, permanent, would become the treatment for one of the most volatile, unpredictable conditions in psychiatry. The stone that steadies the storm. Arfwedson couldn't have known. No one could. But somewhere in that Swedish lab, amid the minerals and acids and careful notes, the future of psychiatric medicine had just been born. It would just take another 130 years for anyone to notice. Fast forward to the mid-1800s, and doctors were starting to get creative. They'd figured out that lithium salts dissolved uric acid in a test tube, which led to a spectacular logical leap. Maybe lithium could dissolve uric acid in the human body too. Gout, kidney stones, rheumatism, anything involving crystals or pain became a lithium target. It was the medical equivalent of throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what stuck. Doctors began prescribing lithium bromide, lithium citrate, and lithium carbonate for everything from arthritis to insomnia. Was there scientific evidence? Not really. Did patients report feeling better? Sometimes. Was it placebo? Possibly. Did anyone care? Absolutely not. This was an era when cocaine was in cough syrup and radium was in beauty creams, so lithium for gout seemed downright reasonable by comparison. The important thing to understand here is that nobody knew how lithium actually worked. They just knew it did something, and in 19th century medicine, something was usually good enough. The logic went like this. Uric acid forms painful crystals in joints causing gout. Lithium dissolves uric acid crystals in a petri dish. Therefore, lithium must dissolve uric acid crystals in your big toe. It's the kind of reasoning that sounds perfectly sensible until you think about it for more than 30 seconds. But doctors in the 1860s weren't particularly concerned with thinking things through. They were concerned with having treatments to offer because patients expected solutions, and I don't know wasn't an acceptable answer. So lithium became the new wonder drug. Physicians prescribed it enthusiastically. Medical journals published glowing reports. Patients with gout swore by it. Whether it actually worked or whether people just felt better because someone in a white coat had finally taken their pain seriously is hard to say. Probably a mix of both. But lithium didn't stop at gout. Oh no. Once doctors decided it was useful, they started prescribing it for everything. Insomnia? Lithium bromide. Anxiety? Lithium bromide. Epilepsy? Why not try lithium bromide? It was the Tylenol of the Victorian era. Except instead of reducing inflammation, it was doing something. No one was quite sure what. But patients kept taking it, and doctors kept prescribing it, and the whole system just kept rolling forward on momentum and optimism. There were some side effects, of course. Patients complained of nausea, weakness, tremors. But in an era when medical treatments included bloodletting, mercury rubs, and intentionally giving people malaria to cure syphilis, a little nausea was barely worth mentioning. You took your lithium, you felt vaguely unwell, and you accepted it as the price of modern medicine. The truly wild part is that some of these treatments probably did work, not because lithium was treating gout or kidney stones, but because it was affecting patients' moods. People with chronic pain are often anxious, depressed, irritable. Lithium, even at these early doses, was likely stabilizing their mental state, making the pain more bearable. They weren't cured, but they were coping better. And in medicine, especially 19th century medicine, coping better was close enough to cured. So lithium carved out a niche, not as a miracle cure, but as a reliable, respectable treatment prescribed by serious doctors for serious ailments. It appeared in medical formularies. Pharmacies stocked it. And slowly, quietly, lithium became part of the medical landscape, a minor player, but a consistent one. No one suspected that this gout medication would one day become the gold standard for treating bipolar disorder. They were too busy dissolving uric acid crystals that may or may not have existed in the first place. By the late 1800s, lithium had gone mainstream in the most American way possible. It became a health fad. Natural springs with trace amounts of lithium were suddenly marketed as healing waters, miraculous cure-alls for every ailment known to humankind. Towns with lithium-rich springs rebranded themselves as health resorts. People traveled hundreds of miles to bathe in, drink, and occasionally gargle lithia water, convinced it would cure their depression, anxiety, digestive problems, and probably their moral failings too. Entrepreneurs bottled the stuff and sold it as lithia water, often with wildly exaggerated claims printed right on the label. One brand promised to cure everything from Bright's disease to nervous exhaustion. Another claimed it would restore vitality and youthful vigor, which in 1895 was code for, "We have no idea what this does, but buy it anyway." The fascinating part, some people probably did feel better. Not because lithia water contained meaningful doses, it didn't, but because belief is a powerful thing, and also because they were finally hydrating, which in an era of whiskey for breakfast probably helped more than the lithium ever could. Let's be clear about something. These natural springs contained lithium in homeopathic doses. We're talking parts per million. You'd have to drink roughly a bathtub's worth to get even close to a therapeutic dose, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the marketing, the mystique, the idea that nature had provided a cure and all you had to do was pay for access to it. The advertisements were spectacular. Lithia water was promoted as nature's pharmacy, a gift from the earth designed to restore balance to the diseased body. One company claimed their water could cure kidney disease, liver complaints, rheumatism, gout, diabetes, and nervous disorders. Another promised it would clear your complexion, sharpen your mind, and improve your disposition. If you were tired, lithia water would energize you. If you were anxious, it would calm you. If you were depressed, it would lift your spirits. It was the original adaptogen, before anyone knew that word, a substance that supposedly gave your body exactly what it needed, no matter what that was. People flocked to lithia springs the way modern wellness tourists flock to Bali or Iceland. They checked into grand hotels, took guided tours of the springs, and participated in elaborate bathing rituals. Some springs offered lithia baths, where you soaked in the mineral-rich water while attendants massaged your temples and assured you that healing was happening. Others sold bottled lithia water by the case, encouraging visitors to take the cure home with them. And here's the thing, people genuinely believed it worked. They wrote testimonials. They recommended it to friends. They returned year after year, convinced that the lithia water was the only thing standing between them and total physical collapse. Were they experiencing a placebo effect? Absolutely. But placebo effects are real effects. If drinking lithia water made you feel better, then it made you feel better. The mechanism didn't matter. The outcome did. Of course, this being America in the Gilded Age, the lithia water industry quickly became riddled with fraud. Some bottled water labeled as lithia contained no lithium at all, just regular spring water with a fancy label. Other brands added lithium salts artificially, which defeated the entire purpose of marketing it as natural but made the doses more consistent. And a few particularly ambitious con artists just bottled tap water, slapped lithia on the label, and sold it to people who desperately wanted to believe. The truly brilliant scam was that lithia water was just expensive enough to seem legitimate, but cheap enough to be accessible. A bottle cost about the same as a decent meal. So even working-class people could afford to participate in the health craze, which made it democratic in a way that other luxury treatments weren't. Everyone could buy into the fantasy. Everyone could hope that maybe, just maybe, this bottle of slightly metallic-tasting water would be the thing that finally fixed them. If you wanted to experience peak lithium mania, you went to Lithia Springs, Georgia. This tiny town became a full-blown tourist destination in the late 1800s, entirely because its natural springs contained lithium. Hotels were built, bathhouses opened. People came by train to soak in the healing waters and drink bottled lithia water like it was champagne. The town's promotional materials promised that the springs could cure everything: liver disease, kidney trouble, indigestion, rheumatism, nervousness, and general malaise. Basically, if you were alive and experiencing the mild inconvenience of being human, Lithia Springs had the answer. At its peak, the town was so popular that Mark Twain allegedly visited. Whether he was there for the lithium or just the novelty of watching people pay money to drink mineral water is unclear, but he reportedly enjoyed himself. The town even bottled and shipped its lithia water nationwide, making it one of the first examples of commercialized wellness culture in America. Today, Lithia Springs is still there, much quieter now, its glory days long gone, but for a brief, sparkling moment in the late 19th century, it was ground zero for America's obsession with putting lithium in everything. The story of Lithia Springs is essentially the story of American capitalism meeting pseudoscience and having a very profitable baby. In 1887, a man named Bowden bought the land after hearing rumors about the healing properties of its springs. He tested the water, confirmed it contained lithium, and immediately understood that he was sitting on a gold mine, not because the lithium did anything particularly useful, but because people believed it did, and belief is the most valuable commodity in the wellness industry. Bowden went all in. He built the Lithia Springs Hotel, a sprawling Victorian structure with wraparound porches and rooms that could accommodate hundreds of guests. He constructed elaborate bathhouses where visitors could soak in the lithium-rich water while attendants applied hot compresses and murmured encouragingly about cellular rejuvenation. He installed a bottling facility and began shipping Lithia Springs water across the country, each bottle emblazoned with testimonials from satisfied customers who swore it had cured their neuralgia, dyspepsia, or vague sense of existential dread. The marketing was genius. Lithia Springs wasn't just selling water, it was selling transformation. Visitors arrived tired, sick, and desperate. They checked into the hotel, drank the prescribed amount of lithia water, usually several glasses a day, took daily baths, and rested in the clean country air. And you know what? Most of them felt better. Not because of the lithium, but because they'd taken a vacation, slept in a comfortable bed, eaten regular meals, stopped drinking whiskey for breakfast, and spent a week not working themselves into an early grave. But they credited the lithium. Of course they did. That's what they'd paid for. That's what the brochures promised. And so they returned home, told their friends, and the cycle continued. Word spread. Lithia Springs became fashionable. Newspapers ran stories about the miraculous cures happening in rural Georgia. Doctors began recommending it to patients who could afford the trip. At its height, Lithia Springs was a legitimate tourist destination. Trains ran directly to the town. Visitors came from as far as New York and Chicago. The hotel hosted dances, concerts, and social events. It became a place to see and be seen, a spa town where wealthy Southerners spent their summers pretending to convalesce while actually just enjoying a nice vacation. The town even attracted celebrities. Whether Mark Twain actually visited is disputed. There's no hard evidence, just local legend. But the claim persists because it's the kind of thing Twain would have done. He loved absurdity, and Lithia Springs was nothing if not absurd. A town built entirely on the premise that slightly metallic-tasting water could cure diseases that doctors couldn't even properly diagnose. But like all health fads, Lithia Springs eventually faded. By the early 20th century, medical science was advancing. Germ theory was gaining acceptance. People were starting to realize that drinking spring water, while pleasant, wasn't actually curing tuberculosis. The hotel burned down in 1912 and was never fully rebuilt. Tourism dried up. The bottling facility closed, and Lithia Springs became just another small southern town, its moment of glory preserved only in faded brochures and dubious local legends. But for a few shining decades, it was the place to go if you wanted to drink your mental health problems away. Here's where things get truly bonkers. In 1929, just weeks before the stock market crashed and America entered the Great Depression, a man named Charles Liper Grigg invented a new soft drink. It was called bib-label lithiated lemon lime soda, which is possibly the worst product name in the history of capitalism. Mercifully, it was later shortened to 7-Up, though no one really knows why. Some say it referred to the 7 ingredients. Others claim it was because the bottles were 7 ounces. The truth is lost to time and corporate rebranding. But here's the kicker. The original formula contained lithium citrate. Yes, the same mood-stabilizing compound that psychiatrists would later prescribe to treat bipolar disorder. Grigg marketed it as a hangover cure and a mood lifter, which, to be fair, it probably was, because it literally contained a psychoactive drug. People drank it at soda fountains, served it at parties, gave it to children. No one questioned it. This was 1929. Cocaine had only recently been removed from Coca-Cola. The idea that your refreshing lemon-lime soda contained a psychiatric medication was just another Tuesday in the unregulated American beverage industry. Charles Liper Grigg was not a chemist or a doctor. He was a salesman who'd worked in the soft drink industry and decided he could do better than his former employers. He wanted to create a lemon-lime soda that would compete with Coca-Cola and stand out in a crowded market. His solution? Add lithium citrate to the formula and market it as a health drink. And honestly, it was brilliant. This was the tail end of the lithia water craze. People already associated lithium with wellness, relaxation, and medical legitimacy. By putting it in soda, Grigg was tapping into an existing cultural belief while also offering something new, a carbonated, sweet, refreshing drink that you could enjoy at soda fountains or buy in bottles. It was lithia water, but fun. The original advertisements for bib-label lithiated lemon-lime soda didn't hide the lithium, they celebrated it. The soda was marketed as a cure for hangovers, which in Prohibition-era America was a bold move. You weren't supposed to admit you'd been drinking illegal alcohol, but everyone knew you had. So why not offer a solution? It was also promoted as a mood enhancer and a digestive aid, claims that were vague enough to be unprovable but specific enough to sound medical. People loved it. The soda had a crisp, clean taste, less syrupy than Coca-Cola, more refreshing than ginger ale. And whether it was the lithium or just the placebo effect, customers swore it made them feel better. Bartenders mixed it with whiskey. Soda fountains served it over ice. Parents gave it to fussy children to calm them down, which in hindsight is absolutely wild. Imagine casually medicating your kid with a psychoactive substance because they wouldn't sit still at dinner. The name was changed to 7-Up in the early 1930s, probably because nobody could remember bib-label lithiated lemon-lime soda and fewer people could pronounce it. The new name was snappy, memorable, and didn't reference lithium at all, which was smart branding. You could sell a mood-enhancing soda without explicitly reminding people they were drinking medicine. For nearly 2 decades, 7-Up contained lithium citrate. Millions of Americans drank it regularly, never knowing, or perhaps not caring, that they were consuming a compound that would one day be tightly regulated and prescribed only under medical supervision. It was normalized, ubiquitous, woven into the fabric of everyday life. You could order a 7-Up at lunch, give one to your kids after school, and have another with dinner. No one thought twice about it. And here's the really strange part. It probably worked. Not as a hangover cure, lithium doesn't do much for dehydration or alcohol metabolism. But as a mood stabilizer? Absolutely. Even at the relatively low doses present in soda, lithium can have subtle effects on mood regulation, So millions of Americans were walking around slightly more emotionally stable than they would have been otherwise, and they had no idea. They just thought 7-Up tasted good. They had no clue they were microdosing psychiatric medication with every sip. For nearly 2 decades, 7-Up and other lithium-laced sodas were everywhere. They were marketed as pick-me-ups, hangover cures and general mood enhancers, which was technically true but also deeply weird when you think about it. Imagine walking into a 1930s drugstore, ordering a lithiated soda, and unknowingly consuming a substance that would one day be controlled and prescribed by psychiatrists. The cultural attitude toward lithium in beverages was remarkably casual. Advertisements didn't hide the lithium content, they bragged about it. 7-Up's early marketing highlighted the lithium citrate as a selling point, promising it would calm your nerves and lift your spirits. And honestly, it probably did. Not because of the placebo effect, but because lithium actually works on the brain. The doses were low, nowhere near therapeutic levels for serious mental illness, but enough to potentially take the edge off a bad day. People drank it at soda fountains, mixed it with ice cream, served it at dinner parties. It was normalized, ubiquitous, and completely uncontroversial until it wasn't. This was the era when soda fountains were social hubs. You didn't just go to the pharmacy to pick up prescriptions. You went there to meet friends, have lunch, and order an ice cream float or a phosphate or a lithiated soda. The soda jerk, yes, that was the actual job title, would mix your drink to order, adding syrups, carbonated water, and in the case of 7-Up and similar beverages, a measured dose of lithium citrate. It wasn't just 7-Up either. Other companies saw the success and jumped in. There was Lithia Cola, which promised all the benefits of cola, plus the calming effects of lithium. There was lithiated lemon soda from various regional bottlers. Every company wanted a piece of the lithium market because consumers genuinely believed it made them feel better, and feeling better sold soda. The marketing was surprisingly honest by modern standards. Ads explicitly mentioned the lithium content. They described it as a natural mineral, sourced from springs, scientifically proven to aid digestion and calm the nerves. They positioned lithiated sodas as health drinks, not quite medicine, but definitely more than just refreshment. You weren't being irresponsible by drinking soda, you were taking care of yourself. It was self-care in a bottle, decades before anyone used that term. Parents gave lithiated sodas to children without hesitation. If your kid was cranky, hyper, or just generally being a kid, you handed them a 7-Up and told them to settle down. Did it work? Probably. Lithium has mood-stabilizing effects even at low doses. Was it ethical? By today's standards, absolutely not. But in the 1930s, parenting advice included giving babies opium-laced teething syrup, so a little lithium in soda was practically health-conscious. The drinks were also popular as hangover remedies, which makes sense when you consider that prohibition was in full effect for much of this period. People were drinking bathtub gin, moonshine, and other questionable alcohols, then waking up feeling like death. A cold, fizzy, slightly medicinal soda probably did help, not because lithium treats hangovers, but because the carbonation settled the stomach, the sugar provided quick energy, and the lithium took the edge off the anxiety and mood swings that come with a brutal hangover. Was it a cure? No. Did it make you functional enough to get through the workday? Probably. What's fascinating is how utterly unremarkable this all seemed at the time. There were no moral panics about lithium in soda, no concerned parents writing letters to newspapers, no doctors warning about long-term effects. Everyone just accepted that sodas could contain mood-altering substances, and that was fine. It was only later, as the FDA began flexing its regulatory muscles and as psychiatry started understanding lithium's true power, that people looked back and thought, wait, we were doing what? The golden age of lithium soda lasted from the late 1920s through the mid-1940s. During that time, millions of Americans regularly consumed lithium without knowing they were participating in a massive, uncontrolled experiment in public mental health. And the wildest part? It probably made them slightly happier, slightly calmer, slightly more stable. Not enough to cure mental illness, but enough to smooth out the rough edges of everyday life. Lithium was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. It just took psychiatry another 30 years to figure that out. By 1948, the party was over. The newly empowered Food and Drug Administration decided that maybe, just maybe, putting a psychoactive substance in soda wasn't the best idea. Lithium was quietly removed from 7-Up and other soft drinks, not because of any specific health crisis, but because regulators were starting to understand that drugs, even ones in your refreshing lemon-lime beverage, probably needed oversight. The timing is fascinating. This was the same era when the FDA was cracking down on patent medicines, snake oil salesmen, and wildly unsafe food additives. Lithium in soda was a casualty of a broader regulatory awakening. 7-Up didn't make a big deal about removing it. There were no press releases, no public outcry, no consumer protests. The lithium just disappeared from the formula, and most people never noticed. The soda kept selling, the brand kept growing, and lithium quietly exited the beverage industry, headed toward a very different destiny: legitimate psychiatric medicine. The FDA's decision wasn't based on any dramatic incident. There was no mass poisoning, no outbreak of lithium toxicity, no news story about children being accidentally medicated by their parents' favorite soda. Instead, the removal of lithium from beverages was part of a slow, bureaucratic shift in how America thought about food and drug safety. The 1930s and 40s were a turning point for the FDA. The agency had been created in 1938 after a disaster involving elixir sulfanilamide, a liquid antibiotic that killed over 100 people because the manufacturer had dissolved the drug in diethylene glycol, basically antifreeze. That tragedy led to new laws requiring safety testing before drugs could be sold to the public. Suddenly, the FDA had teeth, and it started looking around at what Americans were consuming. Lithium in soda became an obvious target, not because it was immediately dangerous, but because it was a drug being sold as a food product. The doses were low, yes, but they were also unregulated. Different brands contained different amounts. Some bottles might have barely any lithium, others might have more than advertised. There was no standardization, no quality control, no medical supervision, and that made regulators nervous. The FDA issued guidance to beverage manufacturers: remove the lithium or reclassify your product as a drug, which would require prescriptions, medical oversight, and a much smaller market. For companies like 7-Up, the choice was obvious. Lithium was a marketing gimmick, not a core part of the formula. The soda tasted fine without it, so they reformulated, quietly removed the lithium citrate, and kept selling. The transition was remarkably smooth. 7-Up continued to market itself as a refreshing, uplifting beverage, just without explicitly mentioning mood enhancement. The advertising shifted from "takes the ouch out of grouch" to "nothing does it like 7-Up," a vaguer slogan that didn't promise medical benefits but still suggested you'd feel better after drinking it. And consumers didn't care. They kept buying it. Most of them didn't even know the formula had changed. Lithium's exit from the beverage industry was undramatic, almost anticlimactic. There were no congressional hearings, no lawsuits, no angry editorials. It just quietly disappeared, like a guest leaving a party early, and for the most part people forgot it had ever been there. But behind the scenes, something interesting was happening. As lithium left the soda fountains, it was entering the world of serious medicine. Researchers in Australia and Europe were starting to experiment with lithium as a treatment for psychiatric conditions. The doses they were using were much higher than what had been in 7-Up, and the results were startling. Lithium, it turned out, wasn't just a mild mood enhancer. It was a powerful psychiatric medication, and by removing it from sodas, the FDA had inadvertently cleared the way for it to be taken seriously as a legitimate treatment. So, in 1948, lithium left the beverage aisle and headed toward the pharmacy. It would be another 22 years before it received FDA approval as a prescription medication, but the journey had begun. The party drug had become a serious drug. And 7-Up? It kept selling just fine without it. Now we jump to Australia, 1949, where a psychiatrist named Cade was conducting experiments that would change mental health treatment forever. Cade was working in a makeshift lab at a psychiatric hospital trying to understand what caused mania. He had a theory that manic patients were excreting some kind of toxin in their urine, so he injected guinea pig urine into guinea pigs, yes, really, to see what would happen. The guinea pigs got sick, which wasn't surprising, but then Cade tried adding lithium salts to the urine to make it easier to inject, and something unexpected happened. The guinea pigs became weirdly calm. Not sedated, just calm. Cade, being a curious and slightly reckless scientist, decided to test lithium on himself first. When he didn't die or go insane, he tried it on his manic patients. The results were stunning. Patients who had been agitated, violent, and unreachable for years suddenly stabilized. Their mania lifted. They became lucid, functional, almost normal. Cade had stumbled onto the first effective treatment for bipolar disorder, entirely by accident, using a substance that had been sold in soda fountains for decades. John Cade was not working in a state-of-the-art research facility. He was working in a converted pantry at Bundora Repatriation Mental Hospital in Melbourne, using equipment he'd scrounged together himself. This wasn't a well-funded pharmaceutical trial. This was one man, a bunch of guinea pigs, and a hunch that turned out to be completely wrong but led to something revolutionary anyway. Cade's original theory, that mania was caused by a toxin in urine, was nonsense. It was based on outdated ideas about mental illness and bodily humours. But bad theories sometimes lead to good discoveries, and this was one of those times. When Cade started injecting guinea pigs with urine from manic patients, he was trying to prove his toxin hypothesis. Instead, he accidentally discovered that lithium had a profound calming effect on the animals. The guinea pigs didn't become drowsy or lethargic, which is what would have happened if he'd given them a sedative. They just became chill. They stopped running around frantically. They sat quietly, groomed themselves, responded normally to stimuli. It was like someone had turned down the volume on their nervous systems without knocking them unconscious. Cade was intrigued but cautious. Lithium had a bad reputation in medicine. A few years earlier, lithium chloride had been marketed as a salt substitute for people with heart disease, and it had killed several people. The problem was that patients used lithium salt the same way they used table salt, liberally and without measuring. They overdosed, developed lithium toxicity, and died. The FDA had cracked down hard, and lithium became associated with danger and death. So Cade knew he was playing with fire, but he also knew he was onto something. He tested lithium on himself, taking small doses and carefully monitoring his response. When nothing terrible happened, he moved on to human trials. His first patient was a 51-year-old man who had been chronically manic for 5 years. He was restless, agitated, incoherent, a classic case of severe mania that hadn't responded to any treatment. Cade gave him lithium citrate. Within days, the man began to improve. His speech became clearer, his agitation decreased. Within weeks, he was calm, rational, and able to hold a conversation. Cade was astonished. He tried lithium on 9 more patients with similar results. Some improved dramatically. Others showed moderate improvement. But all of them got better, which was unheard of in an era when mania was considered untreatable. Cade published his findings in 1949 in the Medical Journal of Australia. The paper was titled Lithium Salts in the Treatment of Psychotic Excitement, and it should have been front-page news. It should have revolutionized psychiatry overnight. But it didn't. Almost no one outside Australia paid attention. Why? Because lithium wasn't patentable. It was a naturally occurring element that anyone could produce cheaply. Pharmaceutical companies had no incentive to fund research, run clinical trials, or market it to doctors. There was no money to be made. And in medicine, as in everything else, money determines what gets attention and what gets ignored. So Cade's discovery sat in obscurity for years. A few European psychiatrists picked up on it and started experimenting with lithium. But in the United States, where the pharmaceutical industry had enormous influence, lithium was dismissed as old-fashioned, dangerous, and unprofitable. It would take another 2 decades and a lot of persistence before lithium finally received the recognition it deserved. But the groundwork had been laid. The guinea pigs had shown the way. And somewhere in a makeshift lab in Melbourne, the future of psychiatric treatment had just been born. Again. You'd think discovering a treatment for one of the most devastating mental illnesses would make John Cade a hero. But in 1949, nobody cared. Lithium wasn't patentable. It was a naturally occurring element, cheap to produce, and impossible to monetize. Pharmaceutical companies had zero interest in funding research or promoting a drug they couldn't profit from. So Cade published his findings in a small Australian medical journal, and the psychiatric world mostly ignored him. It didn't help that lithium had a terrible reputation. A few years earlier, lithium chloride had been marketed as a salt substitute for heart patients, and several people had died from lithium toxicity because they used it like table salt, generously and without medical supervision. The FDA had cracked down, and lithium became associated with danger, not healing. So here was this miracle drug, proven effective for mania, sitting in obscurity because no one could make money off it and everyone was scared of it. It would take nearly 2 decades for lithium to get the recognition it deserved. The salt substitute disaster of the late 1940s cast a long shadow over lithium's medical future. The story went like this. Doctors had started recommending low-sodium diets for patients with heart disease and hypertension. But food without salt tastes terrible, so patients complained. Enterprising companies saw an opportunity and began marketing lithium chloride as a sodium-free salt substitute. It looked like salt, tasted vaguely like salt, and came in a shaker that looked exactly like a salt shaker. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turns out. Patients used lithium chloride the way they used regular salt, on everything, generously, multiple times a day. They didn't measure, they didn't monitor their intake. They just shook it onto their food and hoped for the best. The problem is that lithium has a very narrow therapeutic window. The difference between a helpful dose and a toxic dose is small. And when you're sprinkling it on your scrambled eggs, your chicken, your vegetables, and your potatoes, you're not taking a therapeutic dose. You're taking a dangerous dose. People started getting sick. They developed tremors, confusion, nausea, slurred speech, all signs of lithium toxicity. Some went into renal failure, some had seizures, and some died. The deaths weren't common, but they were well publicized. The FDA issued warnings, then banned lithium chloride as a salt substitute. Newspapers ran stories about the dangers of lithium, and suddenly, lithium went from being a harmless mineral to a toxic substance that killed people. This was the atmosphere into which John Cade introduced his findings about lithium treating mania. The timing could not have been worse. He was asking the medical community to embrace a substance that had just killed people, and to embrace it for one of the most vulnerable patient populations, people with severe mental illness, many of whom were institutionalized and couldn't advocate for themselves. Psychiatrists were understandably skeptical. Why would they risk prescribing something so dangerous when there were safer alternatives? Never mind that the safer alternatives didn't actually work. Electroshock therapy, insulin coma therapy, lobotomies, these were the standard treatments for mania in 1949. And they were brutal, often ineffective, and sometimes fatal, but they were familiar. Lithium was new and scary. Pharmaceutical companies were even less interested. Drug development is expensive. Clinical trials cost millions. Marketing campaigns cost millions more. And for all that investment, companies expect to recoup their costs through patents and exclusivity. But lithium couldn't be patented. Anyone could manufacture it. If one company spent millions proving lithium worked, their competitors could immediately start producing generic versions and undercut them on price. There was no business case for promoting lithium, so no one did. This meant that lithium research languished. A few dedicated psychiatrists in Europe, particularly in Denmark and France, read Cade's paper and started cautiously experimenting with lithium. They saw the same results Cade had seen. Patients improved, mania subsided. People who had been institutionalized for years became stable enough to return home. But without pharmaceutical backing, without large-scale trials, without marketing, these findings remained niche knowledge, passed around in small circles of researchers but never breaking into mainstream psychiatry. Meanwhile, patients continued to suffer. People with bipolar disorder cycled through manic episodes and crushing depressions, often spending years in institutions. Families were torn apart, lives were destroyed, and a treatment that could have helped was sitting on the shelf, ignored, because it didn't fit into the economic model of modern medicine. Cade himself became frustrated. He'd made a genuine breakthrough, and no one seemed to care. He continued treating his own patients with lithium and saw consistent success. But he couldn't get funding for larger studies. He couldn't get pharmaceutical companies interested. He couldn't even get much attention from his colleagues outside Australia. He'd discovered a miracle drug, and the world had collectively shrugged. It would take until the 1960s for researchers in the United States to finally take lithium seriously. And even then, it was an uphill battle against institutional inertia, corporate indifference, and lingering fears from the salt substitute disaster. But slowly, painfully, the evidence accumulated. Lithium worked, and eventually even a system built on profit margins couldn't ignore that forever. Even after Cade's discovery, lithium spent years in regulatory limbo. European countries began using it in the 1950s and 60s, but the United States dragged its feet. The FDA was cautious, and without pharmaceutical companies pushing for approval, there was no funding for large-scale clinical trials. It wasn't until 1970 that the FDA finally approved lithium carbonate for treating mania. 1970. That's more than 20 years after Cade's initial discovery. 2 decades during which countless patients suffered through manic episodes, were institutionalized, or died by suicide, all because a life-saving medication was tied up in bureaucracy and corporate indifference. When approval finally came, it was thanks to persistent researchers, advocacy groups, and psychiatrists who had seen lithium work and refused to let it fade into obscurity. But even then, lithium wasn't celebrated, it was tolerated. It was seen as difficult, dangerous, and old-fashioned, and in many ways, it still is. The story of lithium's FDA approval is a case study in how medical progress can be delayed by factors that have nothing to do with science. The evidence that lithium worked was clear by the early 1960s. Studies from Denmark, particularly the work of psychiatrist Mogens Schau, had demonstrated lithium's effectiveness in preventing both manic and depressive episodes. Schau's research was rigorous, well-designed, and showed dramatic results. Patients on lithium had fewer relapses, fewer hospitalizations, and better long-term outcomes than patients on placebo or other treatments. But in the United States, the FDA required extensive safety and efficacy data before approving any new drug. And because lithium had no pharmaceutical company sponsor, there was no one to fund those studies. Academic researchers applied for grants, but funding was limited. Government agencies were hesitant to invest in a drug that still carried the stigma of the salt substitute deaths. So research moved slowly, underfunded, and understaffed. Meanwhile, European psychiatrists were using lithium routinely. In Denmark, it was the first-line treatment for mania. In France and the UK, it was widely prescribed. These countries had different regulatory systems, less influenced by pharmaceutical industry lobbying, and they'd been quicker to embrace lithium based on the existing evidence. American psychiatrists who trained in Europe saw lithium work and came back to the US frustrated that they couldn't legally prescribe it. Some American doctors started using lithium off-label, importing it from Europe or compounding it themselves. This was technically illegal, but enforcement was lax, and desperate patients were willing to try anything. Word spread through patient networks and psychiatric communities that there was this drug, lithium, that actually worked for mania when nothing else did. But it was hard to get, not officially approved, and came with risks. The breakthrough came in the late 1960s when a group of researchers, led by psychiatrist Samuel Gershon, launched a coordinated effort to gather the data the FDA needed. They conducted multi-site clinical trials, comparing lithium to placebo in patients with bipolar disorder. They meticulously documented side effects, therapeutic levels, and outcomes. They published their findings in major psychiatric journals, and slowly the evidence became overwhelming. In 1970, the FDA finally approved lithium carbonate for the treatment of acute mania. The approval was narrow. Lithium wasn't initially approved for maintenance treatment or for depression, just for acute manic episodes. But it was a start. For the first time in American history, patients with mania had access to a medication that could genuinely help them. The reaction from the psychiatric community was mixed. Some hailed it as a revolution, others remained skeptical, pointing to lithium's narrow therapeutic window and the risk of toxicity. And many simply ignored it, continuing to prescribe the medications they were already familiar with, antipsychotics, sedatives, and mood stabilizers that were newer and more heavily marketed. Pharmaceutical companies, predictably, showed little interest in promoting lithium. It was now approved, which meant they could manufacture it, but they couldn't patent it, which meant they couldn't charge premium prices. Generic lithium carbonate was cheap, pennies per pill. There was no profit in pushing doctors to prescribe it when they could instead promote brand name alternatives that cost 10 or 20 times as much. So lithium's entry into American psychiatry was quiet, almost grudging. It was available, but not celebrated. Effective, but not fashionable. It saved lives, but did so without fanfare, without advertising campaigns, without pharmaceutical reps bringing free samples to doctors' offices. It was the orphan drug of psychiatry, powerful, proven, and perpetually overlooked. And yet, for patients who finally had access to it, lithium was nothing short of miraculous. People who had spent years cycling through manic and depressive episodes, who had been in and out of hospitals, who had lost jobs, relationships, and hope, suddenly found stability. Not a cure, but a chance. And for many of them, that was enough. Here's the strange thing about lithium. Even today, after decades of research, no one fully understands how it works. We know it does. We know it stabilizes mood, prevents manic episodes, reduces suicidal ideation, and has neuroprotective effects. But the exact mechanism? Still a mystery. What we do know is that lithium affects multiple systems in the brain. It modulates neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. It influences intracellular signaling pathways. It affects gene expression. It may even promote neurogenesis, the growth of new brain cells. In other words, lithium doesn't just tweak one thing. It recalibrates the entire system. Think of it like rebooting a computer that's stuck in a loop. Lithium doesn't erase the problem, but it resets the system enough to function again. It's not a cure, it's a stabilizer. And for people with bipolar disorder, that stabilization can mean the difference between chaos and a life worth living. Most psychiatric medications work on one or two specific targets. SSRIs increase serotonin levels. Benzodiazepines enhance GABA. Stimulants boost dopamine and norepinephrine. They're like surgical strikes, precise, targeted, predictable. Lithium is the opposite. It's more like carpet bombing. It affects everything, and we're still not entirely sure which effects matter most. One thing lithium does is modulate the activity of neurotransmitters, the chemical messengers that brain cells use to communicate. It doesn't increase or decrease any single neurotransmitter dramatically. Instead, it seems to smooth out the extremes, preventing the wild swings that characterize bipolar disorder. If serotonin levels spike too high or drop too low, lithium brings them back toward the middle. Same with dopamine, norepinephrine, and glutamate. It's a buffer, a shock absorber for the brain's chemical systems. Lithium also affects intracellular signaling pathways, the complex chains of chemical reactions that happen inside neurons. One key pathway involves inositol, a sugar-like molecule that plays a role in how cells respond to signals from neurotransmitters. Lithium interferes with inositol metabolism, which sounds bad but apparently isn't. By reducing inositol availability, lithium dampens overactive signaling in certain brain circuits. This might explain why it prevents mania, which is essentially the brain getting stuck in overdrive. Another pathway lithium affects is glycogen synthase kinase 3, or GSK3, an enzyme involved in cell survival, inflammation, and neuroplasticity. Lithium inhibits GSK3, which has all sorts of downstream effects. It reduces inflammation in the brain, it promotes the survival of neurons, it encourages the formation of new synaptic connections. Some researchers think this is why lithium has neuroprotective effects. It literally helps the brain heal and rebuild itself. There's also evidence that lithium affects gene expression. It doesn't change your DNA, but it changes which genes are turned on or off in brain cells. This could explain why lithium's effects take time to develop. You don't feel better immediately after taking it, the way you might with a sedative or stimulant. It takes days or weeks for lithium to build up in your system and start changing the way your brain operates at a cellular level. It's not a quick fix, it's a slow rewiring. And then there's the truly wild part. Lithium may promote neurogenesis, the creation of new brain cells. For a long time, scientists believed the adult brain couldn't generate new neurons. We were born with all the brain cells we'd ever have, and it was all downhill from there. But research over the past few decades has shown that's not true. The hippocampus, a brain region involved in memory and emotion, continues producing new neurons throughout life. And lithium seems to encourage that process. It's like fertilizer for brain cells. The mystery is figuring out which of these effects actually matter for treating bipolar disorder. Is it the neurotransmitter modulation, the signaling pathway changes, the neuroprotection, the gene expression, and, quote, probably all of them. Lithium isn't a magic bullet targeting one specific problem. It's a blunt instrument that affects dozens of different processes, and somehow, in aggregate, those effects stabilize mood. It's messy. It's imprecise. It's the opposite of how modern drug design is supposed to work, and yet it works better than almost anything else we've developed since, which tells you something about how little we still understand the brain. If there's one thing that makes lithium terrifying, it's this. The difference between a therapeutic dose and a toxic dose is razor thin. Too little, and it doesn't work. Too much, and it can kill you. This is called a narrow therapeutic window, and lithium's is one of the narrowest in all of psychiatry. Patients on lithium need regular blood tests to monitor their levels. They need to stay hydrated, avoid certain medications, and watch their salt intake, because anything that affects kidney function affects lithium levels. Dehydration, fever, diarrhea, any of these can push lithium levels into the danger zone. Early symptoms of lithium toxicity include nausea, tremors, confusion, and slurred speech. Severe toxicity can cause seizures, kidney failure, coma, and death. This narrow margin is why lithium fell out of favor as newer, safer mood stabilizers entered the market. Why risk toxicity when you can prescribe something more forgiving? But here's the thing. For many patients, nothing works as well as lithium. Not the newer drugs, not the alternatives, nothing. And so they stay on it, navigating that narrow window, because the alternative, untreated bipolar disorder, is worse. Let's talk numbers. A therapeutic lithium level is typically between 0.6 and 1.2 milliequivalents per liter of blood. Toxicity begins around 1.5. Severe toxicity happens above 2.0. Death is possible at 2.5 and increasingly likely as levels climb higher. Notice how small that window is? You need at least 0.6 for the drug to work, but go above 1.5 and you're in trouble. That's a range of less than 1 full unit. For comparison, most medications have therapeutic ranges that span much wider margins. The difference between an effective dose of an SSRI and a dangerous dose is substantial. With lithium, you're walking a tightrope. This means patients on lithium need frequent blood tests, initially every week, then every few weeks, and eventually every few months, once they're stable. The tests measure serum lithium levels to make sure you're in the therapeutic range. Too low, and your psychiatrist increases the dose. Too high, and they reduce it, or tell you to skip a few doses. It's a constant balancing act, but blood tests only tell part of the story. Lithium levels aren't static. They fluctuate based on hydration, kidney function, salt intake, and other medications. If you're dehydrated from exercise, illness, or just not drinking enough water, your kidneys hold on to lithium and levels rise. If you're sick with vomiting or diarrhea, you lose fluids, and again, lithium concentrations increase. If you're taking NSAIDs like ibuprofen or certain blood pressure medications, those can affect how your kidneys process lithium and push levels higher. Salt intake matters too. Sodium and lithium are both handled by the kidneys through similar mechanisms. If you suddenly cut your salt intake, maybe you're trying to eat healthier, or your doctor told you to reduce sodium for blood pressure, your body holds onto lithium more tightly and levels rise. If you suddenly increase salt intake, your body excretes more lithium and levels drop, so patients on lithium are told to keep their salt intake consistent, which is harder than it sounds. Early signs of lithium toxicity are subtle. You might feel a little nauseous. Your hands might shake more than usual. You might feel confused or sluggish. These symptoms are easy to dismiss, especially if you're already dealing with the side effects of the medication, but if you ignore them, they get worse. Moderate toxicity brings severe tremors, diarrhea, vomiting, and slurred speech. You might feel extremely weak or dizzy. Your muscles might twitch involuntarily. Severe lithium toxicity is a medical emergency. At high levels, lithium affects the nervous system and kidneys. You can develop seizures. Your kidneys can shut down, leading to acute renal failure. Your heart rhythm can become dangerously irregular. You can slip into a coma, and if it's not treated immediately with IV fluids, sometimes dialysis, and intensive care, you can die. This is why lithium scares doctors. Prescribing it means taking on responsibility for close monitoring and patient education. It means explaining to patients that they need to stay hydrated, avoid certain medications, and come in for regular blood tests. It means dealing with insurance companies who sometimes balk at covering frequent lab work. It's complicated, time-consuming, and risky. Newer mood stabilizers don't require this level of vigilance, which makes them more appealing to prescribers even if they're less effective. But for patients who respond to lithium, who find stability they've never had with any other medication, that narrow therapeutic window is a price worth paying. They learn to manage it. They get good at recognizing the early signs of trouble. They keep themselves hydrated, avoid risky medications, and show up for their blood tests. Because the alternative isn't just ineffective medication. The alternative is the chaos of untreated bipolar disorder, manic episodes that destroy relationships and careers, depressive episodes that steal months or years, and a suicide risk that never fully goes away. When you frame it that way, navigating lithium's narrow window doesn't seem so scary. It seems like survival. By the 1980s and 90s, the pharmaceutical industry had figured out how to make serious money from mental health. New mood stabilizers like valproate, carbamazepine, and later, atypical antipsychotics flooded the market. These drugs were patentable, profitable, and heavily marketed to doctors. Lithium, meanwhile, remained cheap, generic, and largely ignored. Drug reps didn't push it, conferences didn't feature it, medical journals barely mentioned it. It became the forgotten stepchild of psychiatry, effective but unfashionable. Newer drugs were marketed as safer, easier to tolerate, and more convenient. And in some ways, they were. You didn't need constant blood monitoring. The therapeutic window was wider, but effectiveness? That was another story. Study after study showed that lithium remained the gold standard for preventing manic episodes and reducing suicide risk. Nothing else came close. But gold standards don't make money, and in modern medicine, money talks louder than evidence. The transformation of psychiatry into a profit-driven enterprise happened gradually, but by the 1990s it was complete. Pharmaceutical companies realized that mental health medications were a gold mine. Unlike antibiotics, which you take for a week or two, psychiatric drugs are often prescribed for years or even decades. That's a steady revenue stream. And unlike drugs for physical illnesses, where outcomes are easily measurable, did the infection clear? Did the blood pressure drop? Psychiatric drugs operate in a fuzzier realm where feeling better is subjective and hard to quantify. This makes it easier to market drugs that might not actually be better, just different. Enter valproate, brand name Depakote, approved for mania in 1995. Valproate was originally an anti-seizure medication, but studies showed it also reduced manic symptoms. The manufacturer, Abbott Laboratories, saw an opportunity. They couldn't patent the molecule itself. It had been around since the 1960s, but they could patent specific formulations, marketing strategies, and dosing schedules. They launched an aggressive marketing campaign aimed at psychiatrists, positioning Depakote as a modern alternative to lithium. It was easier to dose, didn't require as much blood monitoring, and had a wider therapeutic window. Sales exploded. Then came the atypical antipsychotics: risperidone, olanzapine, quetiapine, aripiprazole. These drugs were developed for schizophrenia, but quickly gained approval for bipolar disorder. Pharmaceutical companies spent billions marketing them to doctors. They sponsored conferences, funded research, sent armies of drug reps to psychiatric practices with free samples, glossy brochures, and branded pens. They positioned these drugs as breakthrough treatments, safer and more effective than older options. Meanwhile, lithium sat quietly in the corner, unmarketed and unpromoted. No company had a financial incentive to push it. Generic lithium carbonate cost pennies per pill. A month's supply might cost $5 or $10. By contrast, a month of a brand-name, atypical antipsychotic could cost $500 or more. For pharmaceutical companies, the choice was obvious: promote the drugs that make money. Psychiatrists, influenced by this marketing blitz, began prescribing the newer drugs preferentially. Medical education was increasingly sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. Conferences featured talks by key opinion leaders, psychiatrists who were paid consultants for drug companies, who presented data showing the benefits of newer medications while downplaying or ignoring lithium's superior track record. Medical journals, which relied on pharmaceutical advertising revenue, published studies funded by companies with vested interests in promoting their own products. This isn't to say the newer drugs don't work. They do, for some patients. Valproate is effective for acute mania. Atypical antipsychotics can quickly stabilize patients in crisis. But long-term studies consistently showed that lithium outperformed these alternatives in preventing relapse and reducing suicide risk. Yet lithium prescriptions declined while prescriptions for newer, more expensive drugs soared. The shift had consequences. Patients who might have done well on lithium never got the chance to try it because their doctors prescribed something else first. Insurance companies, ironically, sometimes preferred newer medications despite the higher cost because they didn't require the frequent lab monitoring that lithium demanded, which saved administrative hassle even if it cost more in drug prices. By the 2000s, lithium had become what one researcher called the forgotten drug. It was still in textbooks, still recognized as effective, but increasingly treated as a last resort, something you tried only after newer drugs failed. The standard of care had flipped. What had once been first-line treatment was now an afterthought, and through it all, lithium kept working. Patients who stayed on it continued to have better outcomes. Studies continued to show its superiority. But pharmaceutical profits and marketing had reshaped the landscape of psychiatric care in ways that had little to do with what actually helped patients and everything to do with what made money. Lithium was a casualty of an industry that values patents over patients and novelty over efficacy. Here's something most people don't know. Lithium is the only psychiatric medication proven to reduce suicide rates in patients with bipolar disorder. Not just suicidal thoughts, actual suicide deaths. The data is overwhelming. Patients on lithium are significantly less likely to die by suicide compared to those on other mood stabilizers. This isn't a small effect. We're talking about a reduction of up to 60% in some studies. 60%. That's staggering. That's lives saved. And yet, lithium is still underprescribed, underdiscussed, and underappreciated. Why? Partly because of its narrow therapeutic window, partly because it's not profitable, partly because psychiatry has moved toward newer drugs with better marketing, but mostly because mental health care in general is underfunded, under-researched, and depressingly slow to adopt evidence-based practices. Suicide, is a leading cause of death worldwide. Bipolar disorder has one of the highest suicide rates of any mental illness, and we have a medication that demonstrably saves lives. But it's old, it's cheap, and it requires monitoring, so it gets sidelined. Bipolar disorder is brutal. The lifetime suicide rate for people with the condition is estimated at 10 to 15%, higher than almost any other psychiatric diagnosis. During manic episodes, impulsivity and poor judgment can lead to dangerous behavior. During depressive episodes, hopelessness becomes overwhelming. And even during stable periods, the trauma of living with the illness, the social stigma, and the toll it takes on relationships and careers create a persistent suicide risk that never fully disappears. For decades, psychiatrists focused on treating symptoms, stopping mania, lifting depression, but didn't pay much attention to whether treatments actually reduced the risk of death. That changed in the 1990s and 2000s when researchers started looking at long-term outcomes, not just short-term symptom control, and what they found was startling. Lithium saved lives in a way no other psychiatric medication did. The most comprehensive meta-analysis, published in 2013, looked at data from dozens of studies involving thousands of patients. It found that lithium reduced the risk of suicide by approximately 60% compared to placebo or other treatments. This wasn't a marginal benefit. This was a game changer. No other mood stabilizer came close. Valproate didn't reduce suicide risk. Antipsychotics didn't reduce suicide risk. Only lithium did. Researchers don't fully understand why. Part of it is probably lithium's mood-stabilizing effects, preventing the extreme highs and lows that often precede suicidal behavior. But there's evidence that lithium has a specific anti-suicidal effect beyond mood stabilization. Some studies show that lithium reduces impulsivity and aggression, even in people without bipolar disorder. It might dampen the neural circuits involved in self-harm and suicidal ideation. Whatever the mechanism, the effect is real and measurable. So why isn't lithium prescribed more often, especially given this data? The reasons are frustratingly familiar. It's not profitable, so there's no marketing push. It requires monitoring, which is inconvenient. Newer drugs are seen as more modern, even if they're less effective. And perhaps most troubling, many psychiatrists simply aren't aware of the suicide prevention data. Medical education hasn't kept pace with the evidence. Lithium is still taught as an older drug with serious side effects, not as the most effective suicide prevention tool in psychiatry's arsenal. This knowledge gap has real consequences. When a psychiatrist chooses to prescribe a newer mood stabilizer instead of lithium without discussing the suicide data with the patient, they're making that decision on the patient's behalf, often without informed consent. Patients deserve to know that lithium might not just stabilize their mood, but could also save their life. They deserve to weigh that benefit against the side effects and monitoring requirements. But that conversation often doesn't happen. Patient advocacy groups have started pushing back, arguing that lithium should be first-line treatment for bipolar disorder, specifically because of its suicide prevention effects. Some countries, particularly in Scandinavia, have embraced this approach. But in the United States, lithium remains underutilized. A life-saving medication sitting on the shelf while doctors prescribe alternatives that are easier to manage, but less likely to prevent the most devastating outcome of bipolar disorder. The tragedy is that we've had the answer for decades. We've known since the 1970s that lithium reduces suicide risk, and the evidence has only gotten stronger over time. But knowing isn't enough. Changing practice patterns, overcoming institutional inertia, and prioritizing patient outcomes over convenience requires sustained effort, advocacy, and a willingness to challenge the pharmaceutical industry's influence on psychiatry. Until that happens, lithium will continue to be the drug everyone knows works, but few doctors actually prescribe. Let's be real, lithium sucks to take. Even at therapeutic doses, the side effects can be brutal. Tremors are common, especially in the hands. Weight gain is almost inevitable. Cognitive dulling, feeling slower, foggier, less sharp, is a frequent complaint. Many patients describe feeling flattened, like the medication strips away not just the mania but also the joy, creativity, and intensity that made them who they are. Then there's the kidney damage. Long-term lithium use can lead to chronic kidney disease, and in some cases, kidney failure. It's not common, but it's not rare either, and it's irreversible. Thyroid problems are another issue. Lithium interferes with thyroid hormone production, leading to hypothyroidism in a significant percentage of patients. This means more medications, more side effects, more monitoring. For many people, the side effects of lithium feel worse than the illness it's treating. And that's the cruel calculus of psychiatric medication. Do you accept a life dulled by side effects, or risk the chaos of untreated bipolar disorder? The hand tremor is often the first side effect people notice. It's called a fine tremor, a subtle shaking that's most visible when you're trying to do something precise. Writing becomes messier. Holding a coffee cup becomes an exercise in concentration. Threading a needle is basically impossible. For some people, the tremor is mild and manageable. For others, it's severe enough to interfere with daily activities. And there's something particularly demoralizing about a side effect that's constantly visible, a physical reminder every time you look at your hands that you're taking medication, that you're different, that something is wrong with you. Weight gain is another common and deeply frustrating side effect. Lithium affects metabolism and increases appetite. Some people gain 10 or 15 pounds. Others gain 30, 40, 50. The weight creeps on slowly, insidiously, and once it's there, it's incredibly hard to lose. Diet and exercise help, but not as much as they should. The medication seems to fundamentally change how the body processes and stores energy. And in a culture that's obsessed with thinness and equates weight gain with moral failure, this side effect carries enormous psychological baggage. Patients feel ashamed, unattractive, out of control. Some stop taking lithium purely because they can't tolerate the weight gain, even when they know it's helping their mental health. Cognitive dulling is harder to measure but no less real. Patients describe it as feeling like they're thinking through fog. They can't find words as quickly. They lose their train of thought mid-sentence. They struggle with memory, forgetting appointments, conversations, where they put their keys. For people whose sense of self is tied to being quick, sharp, intellectually engaged, this dulling can feel like losing part of who they are. One patient described it as trading my highs and lows for a flat middle where I'm safe but also kind of boring. That's the trade-off, in a nutshell. The kidney damage is more insidious because it happens slowly and silently. Lithium is processed through the kidneys, and over years or decades, it can cause cumulative damage. The kidneys lose their ability to concentrate urine, leading to a condition called nephrogenic diabetes insipidus, where patients produce massive amounts of dilute urine and are constantly thirsty. In some cases, the damage progresses to chronic kidney disease, requiring dialysis or even a kidney transplant. The risk increases with higher doses, longer duration of use, and episodes of toxicity. Regular monitoring can catch early signs, but once the damage is done, it's permanent. Thyroid dysfunction is also common. Lithium inhibits the release of thyroid hormones, causing hypothyroidism in about 20 to 30% of patients. Symptoms include fatigue, weight gain, depression, and cold intolerance. Ironically, many of the same symptoms that bipolar depression causes, which can make it hard to tell whether your depression is from your illness or your medication's effect on your thyroid. The treatment is straightforward, thyroid hormone replacement, but it's yet another pill to take, another doctor to see, another blood test to monitor. Then there are the less common but equally troubling side effects: acne, psoriasis, hair thinning, gastrointestinal upset, sexual dysfunction. Each person's experience is different. Some people tolerate lithium beautifully with minimal side effects. Others develop multiple problems that make the medication almost unbearable. And there's no way to predict ahead of time who will fall into which category. The cruelest part is that the side effects are often most severe in the people who benefit most from the medication. The patients whose bipolar disorder is so severe that only lithium controls it are the same patients who may need higher doses, longer treatment, and therefore face the greatest risk of cumulative side effects. They're stuck in an impossible position: stay on the medication and slowly damage their body, or go off it and risk destroying their life with another manic or depressive episode. This is why adherence is such a problem with lithium. Studies show that up to 50% of patients stop taking it within the first year. Some stop because of side effects. Others stop because they feel better and don't think they need it anymore. Still others stop because the burden of monitoring, the blood tests, the doctor's appointments, the constant vigilance becomes too much. And when patients stop lithium, especially abruptly, relapse rates soar. The very stability the medication provided evaporates, often within weeks or months. So yes, lithium sucks to take. It's a medication that saves lives, but demands a price. And for every patient who stays on it gratefully, accepting the trade-offs, there are others who look at those same trade-offs and decide the cost is too high. Neither choice is wrong. Both are deeply human responses to an impossible situation. There's a persistent belief that treating bipolar disorder with lithium kills creativity, that the medication flattens effect so completely that artists, writers, and musicians lose the spark that made them brilliant. And here's the uncomfortable truth: sometimes it does. There are documented cases of artists who went off lithium because they felt it stifled their work. Some of them relapsed into mania and created their best work. Some of them relapsed and died. Bipolar disorder has long been associated with creative genius. Virginia Woolf, Vincent van Gogh, Sylvia Plath. There's a romantic notion that suffering fuels art. But here's the thing: for every artist who thrived in mania, there are 100 who destroyed themselves. Untreated bipolar disorder doesn't just create masterpieces, it creates wreckage. Lithium doesn't kill creativity. What it does is remove the extremes, the manic highs and depressive lows, and force the brain to operate in a middle range. For some people, that middle range feels flat. For others, it's freedom. The real question isn't whether lithium affects creativity, it's whether staying alive is worth the trade-off. And for most people, the answer is yes. The link between bipolar disorder and creativity isn't a myth. Studies have shown that people with bipolar disorder are overrepresented in creative professions: writers, artists, musicians, poets. And during hypomanic episodes, many people experience bursts of productivity, confidence, and novel thinking. Ideas flow freely, inhibitions disappear. Work that would normally take weeks gets done in days. It's intoxicating, and for creative people, it can feel like the truest version of themselves. The problem is that hypomania doesn't stay hypomania. It escalates into full-blown mania, sleepless nights, reckless behavior, grandiose delusions, and eventually a crash into depression so severe that getting out of bed feels impossible. The creative burst gives way to months of paralysis. The novel that was flowing becomes a half-finished manuscript gathering dust. The paintings stop, the music dies, and the person who felt invincible a few weeks ago now feels worthless. But the mythology persists, that madness and genius are intertwined, that treating the illness will diminish the gift. And lithium, because it's so effective at stabilizing mood, has become the villain in this narrative. Patients report that on lithium, they don't have the manic surges of creativity they once relied on. They write more slowly, their work feels less inspired. The highs that used to feel like touching the divine are gone, replaced by steady, unremarkable normalcy. K. Redfield Jameson, a psychologist and bipolar disorder researcher who has the condition herself, has written extensively about this dilemma. She describes the pull of mania, the euphoria, the productivity, the sense of limitless possibility, and the terror of giving it up. She also describes the devastation, the relationships destroyed, the opportunities lost, the months spent unable to function. In her memoir, An Unquiet Mind, she's honest about the fact that lithium changed her, that it took away some of the intensity she valued. but she's equally clear that it's saved her life. The research on creativity and lithium is mixed. Some studies suggest lithium reduces creativity, others find no effect. Part of the problem is that creativity is hard to measure. How do you quantify inspiration? How do you compare the quality of work produced in different mental states? What one person sees as diminished creativity, another might see as improved focus and discipline. There's also a selection bias in the stories we tell. We hear about the artists who stopped taking lithium and produced brilliant work during their subsequent manic episodes. We don't hear as much about the artists who stopped taking lithium, relapsed, and never created again because the depression was too crushing or because they died by suicide. Survivorship bias makes the risky choice look more appealing than it actually is. For some patients, the solution is compromise. Lower doses of lithium that provide some stability without complete mood flattening. Adjunctive medications that target specific symptoms while preserving some emotional range. Therapy to develop coping strategies that work alongside medication. These approaches aren't perfect, but they acknowledge the legitimate concern that psychiatric treatment can change who you are, not just how you feel. But here's the hard truth. Untreated bipolar disorder is not a sustainable creative strategy. The highs are unreliable, the lows are devastating. The long-term outcome, without treatment, is often tragic. Vincent van Gogh created Starry Night while experiencing severe mental illness. He also died at 37 from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Sylvia Plath wrote The Bell Jar and Ariel while struggling with depression. She died by suicide at 30. The idea that suffering is necessary for great art is romantic until you count the bodies. Lithium offers a different path: steadiness, longevity, the ability to create consistently over decades, rather than in brilliant, destructive bursts. It's not as sexy as the tortured artist narrative, but it's a path that leads to a full life, not just a memorable death. And for many artists, that trade-off, fewer peaks, but also fewer valleys and a lot more years to work, is worth it. Here's where things get weird again. Lithium occurs naturally in groundwater, and some regions have significantly higher concentrations than others. Researchers have noticed something fascinating. Areas with higher lithium levels in drinking water have lower rates of suicide, violent crime, and psychiatric hospitalizations. The doses are minuscule, nowhere near therapeutic levels, but the effect is measurable. This has led to a controversial idea. What if we added low doses of lithium to public drinking water, the same way we add fluoride? It's not as crazy as it sounds. We already fluoridate water to prevent tooth decay. Why not lithium to prevent suicide? The backlash would be immediate and intense. People don't trust public health interventions, especially ones that involve medicating the population without consent, but the data is compelling. And in a world where suicide rates are climbing and mental health infrastructure is collapsing, maybe mass lithiation deserves a serious conversation. Or maybe it's a dystopian nightmare. You decide. Do. The first hints of lithium's presence in drinking water came from studies in Texas in the 1990s. Researchers noticed that counties with higher naturally occurring lithium levels in their water supply had lower suicide rates, lower crime rates, and lower rates of psychiatric hospitalization. The effect was consistent across multiple studies and held up even after controlling for other variables like income, education, and access to mental health care. Similar findings emerged from Japan, Austria, and Greece. Everywhere researchers looked, the pattern was the same. More lithium in the water, fewer suicides. The doses were incredibly low, measured in micrograms per litre, compared to the milligrams per day used in therapeutic treatment. It's thousands of times less than what a psychiatric patient takes. But somehow, it still seemed to matter. The proposed mechanism is that even tiny doses of lithium have subtle mood-stabilizing effects that might reduce impulsivity, aggression, and suicidal ideation at a population level. You wouldn't feel different after drinking the water, any more than you feel different after drinking fluoridated water, but statistically, across an entire population, those tiny doses might shift the curve just enough to save lives. This led to an audacious proposal. What if we deliberately added lithium to public water supplies as a suicide prevention strategy? The argument goes like this. Suicide is a major public health crisis. It's the second leading cause of death among young people and a top 10 cause of death overall in many countries. Mental health services are overwhelmed, underfunded, and inaccessible to many people who need them. But everyone drinks water. If we could reduce suicide rates by even 5 or 10% through water lithiation, we'd save thousands of lives every year at minimal cost. The backlash to this idea would be swift and multifaceted. Libertarians would argue it's government overreach, involuntary medication, a violation of bodily autonomy. Even though we already add fluoride, chlorine, and sometimes other substances to drinking water, lithium feels different because it's a psychiatric drug. The optics are terrible. Conspiracy theorists would have a field day. They're putting mood stabilizers in the water to make us docile and compliant. The memes write themselves. There are also legitimate ethical concerns. Fluoride prevents a specific measurable problem, tooth decay, and the doses are calibrated to be safe for everyone, including children and pregnant women. Lithium is more complicated. We know it has side effects at therapeutic doses, but we don't know much about the long-term effects of chronic exposure to very low doses. What happens to developing fetuses? To children? To people with kidney disease who can't excrete lithium efficiently? The safety studies simply haven't been done. And then there's the question of consent. Fluoridation has been controversial, but tooth decay is universally recognized as a problem, and fluoride doesn't alter mood or behavior. Lithium is different. Even if the doses are too low to cause noticeable effects in most people, the idea of adding a psychiatric medication to the water supply without individual consent crosses a line for many people. It feels paternalistic, invasive, and dystopian. But set aside the ethical and political concerns for a moment and consider the data. If lithium in drinking water genuinely reduces suicide rates, and the evidence suggests it does, how many lives would be saved? Suicide kills over 45,000 Americans every year. If water lithiation reduced that by 10%, we'd save 4,500 lives annually. That's more than the number of people who die from homicide. It's a staggering number. Some researchers have proposed compromise approaches, adding lithium to water supplies in areas with particularly high suicide rates, like rural communities or indigenous reservations where mental health resources are scarce. Others suggest making lithium-supplemented water available as an opt-in choice, the way some communities offer fluoridated and non-fluoridated water. Still others argue that rather than mass lithiation, we should focus on improving access to mental health care, reducing stigma, and addressing the social and economic factors that drive suicide. The debate is ongoing, and for now, no government has seriously pursued mass lithiation. But the fact that it's even being discussed highlights how desperate we are for solutions to the suicide crisis and how powerful lithium is, even in doses too small to feel. It's a reminder that this simple element, discovered in Swedish rocks 200 years ago, still has the power to surprise us, provoke us, and maybe, just maybe, save us. Lithium isn't just a psychiatric drug. It's also a key component in rechargeable batteries, laptops, smartphones, and especially electric vehicles. The demand for lithium has exploded, and so has the environmental destruction associated with extracting it. Most of the world's lithium comes from South America, particularly the lithium triangle spanning Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. Mining operations pump massive amounts of water from underground aquifers, draining precious freshwater resources in some of the driest places on Earth. Indigenous communities have been displaced. Ecosystems have been destroyed. And the psychiatric use of lithium? It's barely a blip in the global demand. The vast majority of mined lithium goes into batteries, but the environmental cost is the same. Every electric car, every smartphone, every laptop is built on the backs of mining operations that are devastating fragile ecosystems. And your lithium carbonate prescription, that's part of the same supply chain. It's a reminder that nothing comes without cost, not even medicine. The Atacama Desert in Chile is one of the driest places on Earth. It's a vast, otherworldly landscape of salt flats, ancient rock formations, and ecosystems adapted to extreme conditions. It's also home to massive lithium reserves trapped in underground brine deposits. And for the past few decades, it's been the site of an extraction boom that's transforming the region and destroying the delicate balance that's existed there for millennia. Lithium extraction works like this. Mining companies drill into the salt flats and pump brine, a lithium-rich saltwater solution, to the surface. The brine is deposited into enormous evaporation ponds, where it sits for months while the sun slowly evaporates the water, leaving behind concentrated lithium salts. It's a simple process, but it's incredibly water-intensive. For every ton of lithium produced, roughly 500,000 gallons of water are consumed. And in the Atacama, where rainfall is measured in millimeters per year, water is the most precious resource there is. The result? Aquifers that have sustained local communities and ecosystems for centuries are being drained. Water tables are dropping. Wetlands that provide habitat for endangered flamingos and other species are drying up. Indigenous communities, primarily the Atacameño people, who have lived in the region for thousands of years, are watching their water sources disappear. They've protested, filed lawsuits, and demanded that mining companies consult with them before expanding operations. Some of those demands have been met, many have been ignored. Bolivia holds the world's largest lithium reserves, locked beneath the Salar de Uyuni, the world's largest salt flat. It's a stunning, surreal landscape that attracts tourists from around the world. It's also a potential economic lifeline for one of South America's poorest countries. The Bolivian government has tried for years to develop its lithium industry, but the efforts have been plagued by mismanagement, corruption, and protests from local communities who fear they'll bear the environmental costs without seeing the economic benefits. Argentina's lithium operations face similar challenges. In the province of Jujuy, mining companies have clashed with indigenous communities over water rights and environmental degradation. The companies argue they're bringing jobs and economic development. The communities argue they're being poisoned, displaced, and robbed of their ancestral lands. And here's the kicker. Almost none of this lithium is being used for psychiatric medication. The global lithium market is dominated by battery production. Electric vehicles alone account for roughly 70% of lithium demand, and that percentage is growing every year as countries push to phase out fossil fuel vehicles. Smartphones, laptops, power tools, grid-scale energy storage, all of these consume lithium. Psychiatric use is a tiny fraction of the total, probably less than 1%. But that doesn't absolve the psychiatric community or lithium patients from responsibility. Every prescription is part of the same supply chain that's draining aquifers and displacing indigenous people. The lithium carbonate tablets dispensed at pharmacies in New York or London or Tokyo came from mines in Chile or Argentina, extracted under conditions that would horrify most of the people taking them. This creates an ethical dilemma. If you have bipolar disorder and lithium is the only medication that works for you, what are you supposed to do? Stop taking it because the mining practices are unethical? That's not a realistic option for most people. Their lives, their stability, their very survival depends on that medication. But pretending the environmental cost doesn't exist isn't an option either. Some researchers are working on alternative lithium sources. There are lithium deposits in Australia, the US, and other countries that might be less environmentally destructive to mine. There's also research into recycling lithium from old batteries, though the technology isn't commercially viable yet. And some scientists are exploring lithium substitutes, other compounds that might have similar mood-stabilizing effects without the supply chain problems. But for now, if you take lithium, you're part of a global system that's beautiful in its capacity to heal and brutal in its capacity to harm. In recent years, a new trend has emerged: microdosing lithium. Wellness influencers and biohackers claim that tiny subtherapeutic doses of lithium can improve mood, enhance cognition, and promote longevity. Some even sell lithium supplements, lithium orotate, marketed as a natural mood booster. The problem? There's almost no scientific evidence to support these claims. The studies on lithium in drinking water show correlations, not causation, and the doses in supplements are so low they're unlikely to have any meaningful effect. But that hasn't stopped people from buying it, taking it, and swearing it works. Is it placebo? Probably. Is it harmless? Mostly. But it's also emblematic of a larger problem: the wellness industry's obsession with medicalizing everything. Lithium went from soda to psychiatry to wellness culture, and somehow we've come full circle. We're once again putting lithium in things we consume casually, calling it self-care and hoping for the best. The wellness industry has an extraordinary talent for taking legitimate science, stripping it of context, and repackaging it as a product for people who want to optimize their lives. Lithium is the latest victim of this process. The logic goes like this. Studies show naturally occurring lithium in drinking water is associated with better mental health outcomes. Therefore, taking lithium supplements must improve mental health. It's a seductive argument, but it's also deeply flawed. Lithium orotate is the supplement of choice for biohackers. It's a form of lithium bound to orotic acid, and it's marketed as being more bioavailable and safer than lithium carbonate, the prescription version. The doses are low, typically 5 to 10 milligrams per serving, compared to the 900 to 1800 milligrams per day used therapeutically. Proponents claim these microdoses provide all the benefits of lithium, mood stabilization, neuroprotection, cognitive enhancement, without the side effects or need for monitoring. The problem is, there's virtually no research supporting these claims. The studies on lithium in drinking water measured naturally occurring exposures over entire lifetimes, in populations, not individuals. You can't extrapolate from that data to conclude that taking a 5 milligram lithium supplement for a few months will have measurable effects. The doses are too low, the exposure too short, and individual variation too high. But the wellness industry doesn't let little things like lack of evidence get in the way of a good marketing campaign. Lithium orotate is sold on Amazon, in health food stores, and on supplement websites with glowing testimonials and claims that skirt just barely on the legal side of what the FDA allows. The language is carefully chosen, supports mood, promotes cognitive health, may help with occasional stress. Nothing specific enough to constitute a medical claim, but enough to plant the idea that this supplement will make you feel better. And you know what? Some people do feel better after taking it. That's the power of placebo. If you believe something will help you, there's a decent chance it will, at least temporarily. The mind is powerful. Expectations shape experience. And when you're paying $30 for a bottle of lithium orotate and reading testimonials from people who swear it changed their lives, you're primed to notice any positive changes and attribute them to the supplement. There's also a selection bias at play. People who buy wellness supplements are often people who are already invested in self-improvement. They're eating better, exercising more, meditating, journaling, doing all the things that genuinely improve mental health. The lithium supplement is just one part of a broader lifestyle change. But it gets the credit because it's the novel element, the thing that feels like a biohack rather than basic self-care. Is lithium orotate dangerous? Probably not. At least not at the doses typically sold. 5 or 10 milligrams of lithium is unlikely to cause toxicity, even with long-term use. But it's not completely risk-free. Lithium accumulates in the body, and if you're taking supplements without medical supervision, you have no idea what your actual lithium levels are. If you have kidney problems, or if you're taking other medications that interact with lithium, even low doses could cause problems. And because supplements aren't regulated the way prescription drugs are, there's no guarantee that the lithium content matches what's on the label. The bigger problem is what this trend represents: a cultural impulse to treat normal human emotions as problems that need to be fixed, optimized, biohacked. Feeling a little down? Take a supplement. Stressed about work? Microdose something. Can't focus? Try nootropics. The message is that you're never quite good enough as you are, that your baseline state needs to be enhanced, that self-improvement is a never-ending project, and there's always another pill, powder, or protocol to try. Lithium deserves better than this. It's a powerful medication with a legitimate role in treating serious mental illness. Turning it into a wellness supplement trivializes that. It blurs the line between medicine and self-optimization in ways that are confusing and potentially harmful. And it distracts from the real conversation we should be having about mental health, how to improve access to evidence-based care, reduce stigma, and support people who are genuinely struggling, not just people who want to upgrade their already functional brains. Despite all the side effects, all the monitoring, all the downsides, there are patients who will tell you lithium saved their lives. Not metaphorically, literally. People who spent years cycling through manic episodes and crushing depressions, who lost jobs, relationships, stability, everything, and then started lithium and finally felt stable. For them, the side effects are worth it. The blood tests are worth it. The tremors, the weight gain, the cognitive dulling, all of it is worth it, because the alternative was unbearable. These patients are often the most vocal advocates for lithium. They push back against the narrative that lithium is outdated or dangerous. They know it's not perfect, but they also know it works when nothing else does. And they're frustrated that newer, flashier medications get all the attention while lithium gets sidelined. Because for them, lithium isn't just a medication, it's the thing that gave them their life back. Meet Sarah. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder at 23 after a manic episode that ended with her being hospitalized involuntarily. She'd gone days without sleeping, spent money she didn't have, believed she was destined to be a famous musician despite never having played an instrument, and eventually became so agitated and paranoid that her family called the police. The hospitalization was traumatic. Being held against her will, sedated with antipsychotics that made her feel like a zombie, and told she had a chronic mental illness she'd have to manage for the rest of her life. It was devastating. After discharge, her psychiatrist tried her on various medications, mood stabilizers, antipsychotics, antidepressants. Some helped a little. Some made things worse. She cycled through medications the way some people cycle through jobs, always hoping the next one would be the answer. It wasn't. She had another manic episode 2 years later, followed by a depression so severe she couldn't get out of bed for weeks. She lost her job. Her relationship fell apart. She moved back in with her parents, feeling like a failure at 25. Finally, a new psychiatrist suggested lithium. Sarah was reluctant. She'd heard it was old-fashioned, that the side effects were terrible, that it required constant monitoring. But she was also desperate. She'd tried everything else. What did she have to lose? She started lithium, and within a few weeks something shifted. The racing thoughts slowed down. The irritability faded. She started sleeping through the night, and for the first time in years she felt steady. Not euphoric, not numb, just steady. She's been on lithium for 8 years now. She's had side effects, weight gain, hand tremors, thyroid problems that required additional medication. She gets blood tests every 3 months. She carries a water bottle everywhere because dehydration can spike her lithium levels. She's careful about which medications she takes for headaches or stomach bugs because some interact with lithium. It's a lot to manage, but she's also been stable for 8 years. She finished her degree, she got a job she likes. She's in a healthy relationship. She reconnected with friends she'd pushed away during her worst episodes. Sarah is one of many patients for whom lithium isn't just a medication, it's a lifeline. And she's become an advocate, speaking openly about her experience, pushing back when people dismiss lithium as dangerous or outdated. She's joined online support groups for people with bipolar disorder and become a resource for newly diagnosed patients trying to navigate treatment options. She tells them the truth. Lithium is hard. The side effects are real. The monitoring is inconvenient, but it works. And for people whose bipolar disorder is severe, who've tried other medications without success, it might be the only thing that works. There's also Mark, a 52-year-old who's been on lithium for 30 years. He was diagnosed in his early 20s during a time when lithium was still first-line treatment. He's never tried anything else, never needed to. Lithium worked for him from the start, and he's stayed on it ever since. He's had kidney function tests that show some decline, which worries him, but his doctors say it's manageable. He's accepted that he'll probably be on lithium for the rest of his life, and he's okay with that. It's a small price to pay for 3 decades of stability. Then there's Jennifer, who tried multiple medications over 10 years before finally being prescribed lithium. She was frustrated that it took so long, that lithium was treated as a last resort rather than a first option. When she finally started it and experienced the mood stability it provided, she felt angry. Angry that she'd spent a decade suffering through ineffective treatments. Angry that lithium's reputation had kept doctors from prescribing it sooner. Angry at a system that prioritizes newer, more expensive drugs over the one that actually works. These patients are living proof that lithium isn't just a relic of psychiatric history. It's a medication that continues to change lives, that offers stability in a condition defined by instability, that saves people from the worst version of themselves. They're tired of lithium being dismissed, tired of being told they're on an old-fashioned drug, tired of the assumption that newer must be better. They know what works for them, and they're not apologizing for it. Talk to psychiatrists about lithium, and you'll get wildly different answers. Some call it the gold standard, the most effective mood stabilizer we have. Others avoid it entirely, preferring newer drugs with wider therapeutic windows and fewer side effects. The divide often comes down to experience and philosophy. Older psychiatrists who trained in the era when lithium was first-line treatment tend to trust it more. Younger psychiatrists, trained in the age of atypical antipsychotics and aggressive marketing, are more cautious. There's also the issue of liability. Prescribing lithium requires close monitoring. Miss a toxic level, and the consequences can be severe. It's easier, safer, and more defensible to prescribe a newer drug, even if the evidence isn't as strong. But the best psychiatrists, the ones who prioritize outcomes over convenience, still reach for lithium when patients need it. Because sometimes, evidence matters more than ease. The generational divide in psychiatry is real. Talk to a psychiatrist who completed training in the 1970s or 80s, and they'll tell you lithium stories, patients who were transformed, lives that were saved, the medication that actually worked when nothing else did. They saw lithium before the pharmaceutical marketing machine created alternatives. They learned to manage the narrow therapeutic window, to educate patients about hydration and salt intake, to monitor blood levels religiously. For them, lithium isn't scary. It's familiar. It's what they know works. Now talk to a psychiatrist who finished residency in the 2000s or 2010s. They trained in a different era. Pharmaceutical reps visited their hospitals weekly with catered lunches and glossy presentations about newer mood stabilizers. Their attending physicians often skipped lithium entirely, jumping straight to valproate or atypical antipsychotics. Medical conferences featured talks sponsored by drug companies promoting alternatives. Lithium was presented as old-fashioned, difficult, risky, something you tried only after everything else failed. Many young psychiatrists finish training having prescribed lithium to maybe 2 or 3 patients, if that. They don't have the clinical experience to feel confident with it. There's also a philosophical divide. Some psychiatrists practice defensively, always thinking about liability. What happens if something goes wrong? What will the medical board say? What will the lawyers argue? Lithium, with its narrow therapeutic window and potential for toxicity, feels legally risky. If you prescribe a newer drug and the patient doesn't improve, you can argue you followed standard practice. But if you prescribe lithium and the patient develops kidney problems or lithium toxicity, you're explaining why you chose the riskier option. It's not fair, but it's reality. Defensive medicine shapes prescribing patterns as much as evidence does. Then there's the convenience factor. Prescribing lithium means ongoing blood monitoring, patient education, careful dose adjustments, and regular follow-up. It's time-consuming. In a healthcare system that increasingly demands psychiatrists see more patients in less time, lithium is a hard sell. A 15-minute medication check isn't enough to properly monitor someone on lithium. You need longer appointments, which means fewer patients, which means less revenue for the practice. Newer drugs that don't require blood tests fit better into the modern healthcare business model. But there's another group of psychiatrists, the ones who prioritize evidence over convenience. They've read the studies. They know lithium outperforms alternatives for preventing relapse and reducing suicide. They've seen patients stabilize on lithium after years of cycling through other medications. These doctors take the time to educate patients, to set up monitoring systems, to prescribe lithium when it's truly indicated. They're willing to do the extra work because they've seen the results. The problem is that these evidence-based prescribers are fighting against institutional inertia, pharmaceutical industry influence, and a healthcare system that rewards speed over thoroughness. Training programs don't emphasize lithium. Continuing education is often sponsored by companies with competing products. Insurance companies sometimes question lithium prescriptions, asking why newer drugs weren't tried first, even though lithium has better evidence. So the psychiatrists who still prescribe lithium regularly are often the older ones who remember when it was standard practice, the academic researchers who stay current with the literature, and the deeply principled clinicians who refuse to let marketing override evidence. They're outliers in a system that's moved on. And their patients, the ones who benefit from lithium's superior efficacy, are often the lucky ones who happen to find a doctor willing to swim against the current. Valproate, carbamazepine, lamotrigine, atypical antipsychotics, these are the drugs that have largely replaced lithium as first-line treatments for bipolar disorder. They're newer, they're marketed aggressively, and they're undeniably easier to manage. But do they work as well? The short answer: sometimes. Valproate is effective for acute mania but doesn't prevent suicide the way lithium does. Lamotrigine is great for bipolar depression but useless for mania. Atypical antipsychotics work quickly but come with their own brutal side effects: weight gain, metabolic syndrome, diabetes. None of them have lithium's track record for long-term mood stabilization. None of them reduce suicide risk the way lithium does. And yet, they're prescribed far more often because they're easier to manage and more profitable to sell. The truth is, there is no perfect mood stabilizer. Every option is a trade-off. But lithium remains the benchmark, the drug all others are measured against. Let's start with Valproate, sold as Depakote. It was approved for mania in 1995 and quickly became popular because it works fast. During an acute manic episode, Valproate can calm someone down within days, which is genuinely useful in crisis situations. It also doesn't require the same intense blood monitoring as lithium. Levels need checking, but the therapeutic window is wider and toxicity is less immediately dangerous. Sounds great, right? The problem emerges when you look at long-term outcomes. Valproate is good at treating acute mania, but it's not as effective at preventing future episodes. And it doesn't reduce suicide risk. The side effects are also significant: weight gain, hair loss, tremor, liver toxicity, and in women of childbearing age, a serious risk of birth defects, much higher than with lithium. It's also sedating, which some patients experience as cognitive slowing similar to what they dislike about lithium. So you trade lithium's kidney concerns for Valproate's liver concerns, gain similar cognitive effects, and lose the suicide prevention benefit. Not exactly a clear win. Then there's lamotrigine, which entered the bipolar market in the early 2000s. Lamotrigine has a different profile. It's not particularly effective for mania, but it works well for bipolar depression and seems to prevent depressive episodes. For patients whose bipolar disorder is characterized more by depression than mania, it can be genuinely helpful. The side effects are generally milder than lithium or Valproate: less weight gain, less cognitive dulling. It seems like the perfect alternative, except lamotrigine has its own scary risk: a potentially fatal rash called Stevens-Johnson syndrome. It's rare, but when it happens, it's devastating. Skin literally sloughing off, requiring hospitalization, sometimes fatal. To minimize this risk, lamotrigine has to be started at a very low dose and increased incredibly slowly over weeks or months. This means it takes forever to reach a therapeutic level. If someone's in crisis, lamotrigine isn't an option. It's too slow. And again, it doesn't prevent suicide the way lithium does. The atypical antipsychotics, risperidone, olanzapine, quetiapine, aripiprazole, have become incredibly popular for bipolar disorder, even though they were originally developed for schizophrenia. They work quickly, which makes them attractive in acute situations. Someone in a full manic episode, psychotic and dangerous, can be calmed with an atypical antipsychotic within hours or days. For crisis stabilization, they're genuinely useful. But long-term use is where the problems emerge. Weight gain with atypical antipsychotics isn't 10 or 15 pounds. It's often 30, 40, 50 pounds or more. They cause metabolic syndrome, high blood sugar, high cholesterol, insulin resistance. Patients on these medications long-term have significantly increased risks of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. They're also sedating, cause cognitive dulling, and can lead to movement disorders. Some cause hormonal changes, elevated prolactin levels leading to sexual dysfunction and breast development in men. The side effect profile is brutal. And here's the kicker. While atypical antipsychotics work well for acute mania, the evidence for their effectiveness in preventing future episodes is mixed. Some studies show benefit, others don't. And none of them reduce suicide risk the way lithium does. So you're trading lithium's narrow therapeutic window and kidney concerns for medications that cause massive weight gain, diabetes risk, and unclear long-term efficacy. Carbamazepine, another older mood stabilizer, has fallen out of favor because it requires monitoring similar to lithium but with less impressive efficacy data. It also interacts with numerous other medications, making it complicated to prescribe. The truth psychiatry doesn't want to admit is that we haven't found anything better than lithium. We've found things that are easier to prescribe, more profitable to sell, and less legally scary. But better? Not really. Every alternative is a compromise. And for patients whose bipolar disorder is severe, who need the best possible chance of stability and survival, lithium remains the answer. It's just not the answer pharmaceutical companies want to promote, insurance companies want to cover, or busy psychiatrists want to manage. So patients often don't get it until they've tried everything else and suffered unnecessarily for years. That's not evidence-based medicine. That's convenience-based medicine. And it's failing the people who need help most. There's a stigma attached to lithium that doesn't apply to other psychiatric medications. Part of it is cultural. Lithium is associated with severe mental illness, with institutionalization, with losing control. Taking lithium means admitting you have bipolar disorder, which still carries a heavy social burden. But there's also a generational stigma. Lithium feels old-fashioned, something your grandmother might have taken. It's not sleek or modern. It doesn't come in a glossy pill pack with a lifestyle brand attached to it. And then there's the self-stigma. Many patients resist lithium because taking it feels like giving up, like admitting they need serious, heavy-duty medication. They'd rather try alternatives, supplements, therapy, anything to avoid the label that comes with lithium. But here's the thing. Stigma doesn't treat mental illness. And refusing lithium because of what it represents doesn't make the illness go away. Sometimes the best treatment is the one that works, no matter what it's called. The cultural baggage around lithium is enormous. When most people hear lithium, they think of psychiatric hospitals, straitjackets, electroshock therapy, the whole mid-20th century mental institution nightmare. Even though modern bipolar treatment is nothing like that, the association persists. Lithium carries the weight of that history. It's the medication that marks you as seriously mentally ill, not just anxious or a little depressed, but actually, clinically, diagnostically, mentally ill, in a way that requires powerful medication. Compare that to how we talk about other psychiatric drugs. SSRIs for depression and anxiety have been successfully normalized. Celebrities talk openly about taking Prozac or Zoloft. It's almost fashionable in some circles to joke about your antidepressant. ADHD medications have been similarly destigmatized, especially among professionals who frame them as productivity enhancers. Even antipsychotics are sometimes prescribed for sleep or anxiety at low doses, which makes them feel less scary. But lithium? Nobody's joking about their lithium prescription. Nobody's casually mentioning at brunch that they take it. It remains firmly in the category of serious mental illness medication, and that category still frightens people. There's a sense that if you're on lithium, you're really crazy. Not just struggling with your mental health, everyone does that, but fundamentally, perhaps permanently, broken in a way that requires serious pharmaceutical intervention. The generational stigma adds another layer. Lithium is old. It's been around for 75 years. In a culture obsessed with innovation and the new, old feels suspect. We've internalized the message that newer is better, that medical science progresses linearly, that old treatments must be inferior to new ones. So lithium feels like something your grandparents' generation took, back when psychiatry was primitive and barbaric. Never mind that it works better than the newer alternatives, it still feels outdated. The pharmaceutical industry has reinforced this perception. When marketing newer mood stabilizers, companies subtly positioned them as modern alternatives to traditional lithium. The messaging suggested that lithium was something we used to rely on before we knew better. The glossy brochures, the branded packaging, the lifestyle marketing, all of it made newer drugs feel sophisticated and contemporary, while lithium, sold in generic white bottles with plain labels, felt like a relic. Then there's self-stigma, which might be the most insidious form. This is what happens when patients internalize society's messages about mental illness and serious psychiatric medication. They resist lithium not because doctors recommend against it or because the side effects are unbearable, but because taking it feels like admitting defeat. It feels like crossing a line from "I'm managing my mental health" to "I'm a psychiatric patient." Many people spend years trying alternatives. Therapy, exercise, diet changes, supplements, meditation, anything that feels less medical, less serious, less stigmatized. They'll try mood stabilizers that don't work as well but feel more acceptable because they're newer or have better marketing. They'll white-knuckle through episodes, convincing themselves they don't need medication that serious, and all the while, they're suffering unnecessarily. The tragedy is that lithium works. For many patients, it's the difference between chaos and stability, between being able to work and being disabled, between surviving and thriving. But stigma, cultural, generational, and internalized, keeps people from accessing it. They'd rather suffer than take a medication that confirms what they fear most about themselves, that they're really, seriously, permanently, mentally ill. But here's what needs to be said. Taking lithium doesn't make you more mentally ill. It makes you treated. The illness exists whether you acknowledge it or not, whether you medicate it or not. Lithium doesn't create bipolar disorder. It manages it. And managing a chronic illness, whether it's diabetes or bipolar disorder, isn't weakness or failure. It's self-care. It's survival. It's choosing to live the fullest life possible with the tools available. The stigma around lithium says more about society's discomfort with mental illness than it does about the medication or the people who take it. Until we can talk about psychiatric medication the way we talk about blood pressure medication or insulin, as medical treatment for medical conditions, nothing more, nothing less. People will continue suffering unnecessarily rather than risk the label that comes with taking the drug that actually works. Lithium is a Category D drug during pregnancy, meaning it poses risks to the developing fetus. Studies have shown an increased risk of cardiac defects, particularly Ebstein's anomaly, a rare but serious heart malformation. For women with bipolar disorder who want to have children, this creates an impossible dilemma. Stay on lithium and risk harming your baby, or stop lithium and risk relapsing into mania or depression. There's no good answer. Some women stop lithium before conception and white-knuckle their way through pregnancy, hoping to stay stable. Some continue low doses under close medical supervision. Some switch to alternatives, even though nothing works as well. And some choose not to have children at all because the risk feels too great. It's a devastating choice, and it highlights one of the cruelest aspects of chronic mental illness, the way it forces people to choose between their health and their dreams. The statistics are stark. Ebstein's anomaly occurs in about 1 in 20,000 births in the general population. For women taking lithium during the first trimester, the risk jumps to roughly 1 in 1,000, a 20-fold increase. It's still relatively rare, but when you're the woman making the decision, a 1 in 1,000 chance of giving your baby a serious heart defect is terrifying. Ebstein's anomaly can range from mild to severe. In mild cases, children live relatively normal lives with monitoring. In severe cases, they need multiple heart surgeries starting in infancy, face lifelong complications, and have reduced life expectancy. So women with bipolar disorder face an excruciating calculation. If you stop lithium to protect your baby, what happens to you? Pregnancy itself can be destabilizing for bipolar disorder. Hormonal changes, sleep disruption, and the stress of pregnancy can trigger episodes. Some women who've been stable for years relapse within weeks of stopping lithium. A manic episode during pregnancy is dangerous, risky behavior, poor judgment, potential for self-harm. A severe depressive episode is equally concerning. Inability to care for yourself, suicidal ideation, and the devastating impact of maternal depression on fetal development. And then there's postpartum. The weeks and months after giving birth are the highest risk period for bipolar relapse. The combination of massive hormonal shifts, sleep deprivation, and stress creates perfect conditions for mood episodes. Women who stopped lithium during pregnancy and managed to stay stable often relapse postpartum, sometimes catastrophically. Postpartum psychosis, while rare, is more common in women with bipolar disorder, and it's a psychiatric emergency. Without medication, the risk is significant. So what do women do? Some decide to stay on lithium, accepting the small but real risk to their baby because the risk to themselves is larger and more certain. They work with high-risk obstetric teams, get frequent ultrasounds to monitor fetal heart development, and make peace with their decision as best they can. It's not easy. There's guilt, anxiety, constant second-guessing. But for some women, it's the only way to survive pregnancy intact. Others choose to stop lithium and try to manage without it. They might switch to alternatives with better pregnancy safety profiles. Lamotrigine is sometimes used. Though the evidence for its safety is better than for lithium, its efficacy for mania is questionable. Some women try to get through pregnancy with intensive therapy, careful sleep management, and strong support systems. Some succeed. Others relapse and face the agonizing decision of whether to restart medication mid-pregnancy, weighing the risks to the baby at different gestational stages against the risks of untreated mania or depression. There's also the option of preconception planning, working with a psychiatrist to taper off lithium slowly before trying to conceive, hopefully staying stable through the pregnancy, and restarting immediately after delivery. But this only works if pregnancy happens quickly. Extended periods off lithium mean extended periods of risk, and not every woman can plan pregnancy. Life happens. Then there are the women who choose not to have children at all. They look at the impossible choice, risk your baby's health or risk your own, and decide the only winning move is not to play. They mourn the family they won't have, grieve the future they're giving up, and try to make peace with a decision made under circumstances that should never exist. It's a devastating loss, and it's one more way that bipolar disorder steals things from people. The medical community hasn't done enough to support women facing this choice. Guidelines exist, but they're vague and leave enormous room for interpretation. Some doctors refuse to prescribe lithium to any woman of childbearing age, which is paternalistic and takes away patient autonomy. Others don't adequately warn women about the risks, leaving them to discover during pregnancy that they've exposed their baby to harm. What's needed is honest, compassionate, nuanced counseling that acknowledges there are no perfect answers and supports women in making informed decisions based on their individual circumstances. The lithium and pregnancy dilemma reveals something fundamental about how we fail people with chronic mental illness. We expect them to manage complex medical decisions, to weigh statistical risks, to sacrifice their own health or their dreams of parenthood. all while navigating a healthcare system that often provides inadequate support and guidance. It's not enough to say talk to your doctor. Women deserve better options, better evidence, and better support. Until that exists, they'll continue making impossible choices with insufficient information and living with the consequences either way. So tonight, as you lie in your clean bed with climate control and easy access to water that won't kill you, take a moment to think about lithium, this strange lightweight element that floats on water and reacts with air, this substance that was hiding in Swedish rocks for billions of years before anyone noticed. This compound that spent decades in your great-grandparents' soda, marketed as a pick-me-up and hangover cure, casually medicating an entire generation without anyone really understanding what it was doing. Lithium's journey is one of the strangest stories in medical history. It went from mineral curiosity to patent medicine to soft drink ingredient to banned substance to life-saving psychiatric medication, all within the span of a century and a half. It was discovered by accident. Its psychiatric benefits were stumbled upon by a man injecting guinea pig urine into guinea pigs, and it took 20 years to get FDA approval because no pharmaceutical company could profit from it. Even today, with mountains of evidence showing it's the most effective treatment we have for bipolar disorder, it remains underprescribed, underappreciated, and frequently forgotten in favor of newer drugs with better marketing. But here's what makes Lithium's story so profoundly human. It works. Despite the messy history, the corporate indifference, the narrow therapeutic window, the side effects and the stigma, it works. It stabilizes moods when nothing else can. It prevents suicide more effectively than any other psychiatric medication. It's given countless people their lives back, allowed them to hold jobs, maintain relationships, raise families, pursue dreams that seemed impossible when they were cycling through untreated mania and depression. Lithium teaches us something important about medicine and about ourselves. It reminds us that the best treatments aren't always the most profitable ones, that natural substances can be as powerful as synthetic drugs designed in laboratories, that sometimes the answer has been sitting in front of us for decades, waiting for us to pay attention. And it reminds us that mental illness is real, biological, treatable, not a moral failing or a weakness of character, but a medical condition that responds to medical intervention. Think about what it must have been like to be one of John Cade's first patients in 1949. You've been manic for years, institutionalized, unreachable, lost to everyone who loves you. And then this doctor gives you a simple salt derived from rocks, and slowly, miraculously, you come back to yourself. Your thoughts slow down. The agitation fades. You can think clearly for the first time in years. You recognize your family. You remember who you were before the illness consumed you. That must have felt like magic, and in a way, it was. Or, think about what it's like to be a patient today, sitting in a psychiatrist's office, being handed a prescription for lithium. Maybe you're scared. You've heard about the side effects, the blood tests, the toxicity risk. Maybe you're skeptical because you've tried so many other medications that didn't work. Or maybe you're just desperate, willing to try anything if it means you might finally feel stable. And then, weeks or months later, you realize the medication is working. The chaos has quieted. You're sleeping through the night. You can focus on conversations without your thoughts racing ahead. You can plan for the future instead of just surviving the present. That's not magic. That's lithium doing what it's done for millions of people over the past 75 years. Lithium's story is also a reminder of how much we still don't understand about the brain and mental illness. We've been using this medication for 3/4 of a century, and we still can't fully explain how it works. We know it affects neurotransmitters, signaling pathways, gene expression, and neurogenesis. We know it stabilizes mood and reduces suicide risk. But the exact mechanism, the precise reason why this simple element can calm the storms in a bipolar brain, remains partially mysterious. And maybe that's okay. Maybe not everything needs to be fully understood to be useful. Sometimes it's enough to know that it works. But lithium's story is also a cautionary tale about how medicine gets shaped by forces that have nothing to do with what's best for patients. It shows us how a life-saving medication can languish in obscurity because it's not profitable, how pharmaceutical companies can flood the market with newer, more expensive alternatives even when the older drug works better, how marketing and convenience can trump evidence, and how patients often pay the price for these decisions, going years without effective treatment because their doctors were influenced by factors that had nothing to do with science. So what happens next for lithium? Will it experience a renaissance as psychiatry rediscovers its unique benefits, particularly for suicide prevention? Or will it continue to fade into the background, replaced by newer drugs that are easier to manage but less effective? Will we ever figure out how to improve it, to capture its benefits without the narrow therapeutic window and cumulative side effects? Or will we find something entirely new that makes lithium obsolete? The answers aren't clear. But what is clear is that lithium has earned its place in medical history, not just as a curiosity or a footnote, but as one of the most important psychiatric medications ever discovered. It's imperfect, demanding, sometimes difficult to tolerate, but for the people it helps, it's irreplaceable. And maybe that's the real lesson of lithium's 100-year journey from soda fountain to psychiatric ward, that healing is rarely simple, that progress is messy and non-linear, and that sometimes the most powerful treatments are the ones that have been with us all along, hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to recognize their value. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, think about the element that was born in the Big Bang, forged in dying stars, buried in rocks for eons, discovered by a Swedish chemist, sold in soft drinks, banned by regulators, tested on guinea pigs, and finally recognized as a medication that can bring stability to minds that desperately need it. Think about the patients who take it every day, accepting the side effects and the monitoring because the alternative, life without it, is unthinkable. Think about the researchers who fought for decades to get it approved despite having no financial incentive to do so. And think about the people who might be alive today because lithium reduced their suicide risk just enough to get them through their darkest moments. Lithium's story isn't over. It's still being written by the patients who take it, the doctors who prescribe it, the researchers who study it, and the advocates who fight for better access to mental health care. It's a story about science and commerce, hope and desperation, failure and resilience. It's a story about how a simple element can change lives, even when we don't fully understand how or why. Because history may be full of strange detours and unexpected discoveries, but it's also proof that sometimes, just sometimes, we stumble onto something real, something that works, something that saves lives. And lithium, for all its complications and contradictions, is exactly that. Sweet dreams. And if you're one of the millions of people whose life has been touched by lithium in any way, whether you take it, prescribe it, research it, or love someone who depends on it, know that you're part of one of the most fascinating stories in the history of medicine. Rest well,